So I'm going to be talking about 9 ways that enterprises mismanage their cyber risk. And it's really sort of all under the umbrella of IT governance. Recently put out a paper in conjunction with my co-author, Courtney Brammer. She is from Cybersecurity Case Studies, and Courtney is great. She comes from an audit compliance background, specifically in the financial services sector. And she has a website, Cybersecurity Case Studies, where she actually curates hundreds, actually thousands, I think, of cybersecurity case studies with associated loss amounts. And we'll get into this in the presentation, but she is a great resource if you ever need to think or look at specific loss amounts tied to cyber events. Really can't endorse her website and her as a resource too much. She's fantastic. So jumping into this, we are going to start here, and we're just going to sort of talk about the background on this whole presentation, which is that IT risk management really has become a moonshot. And for most of you, you know this, if you've worked in IT or IT risk management or security for any length of time, you know that because of the technical complexity in the enterprise, and because we are now dealing with adversaries that have pretty much near limitless resources and focus, in order to have a fighting chance, organizations really do have to implement good governance. And because this really has turned into a moonshot when you think about trying to iteratively reduce risk, right, in a continuous fashion across the organization. So that being said, what is governance? What is the actual definition of governance? I actually stole this from an HBR, a Harvard Business Review article, I think from 2004. And I'm not sure that they were the actual originator of this definition, but I like it a lot, and I stole it. So I think the first part of the definition is what we all sort of think about when we think about governance. We think about who is responsible for certain things, who has the authority to make certain decisions. And obviously this term became very popular following all of the accounting scandals that happened with Enron and WorldCom in the early 2000s. But it's really the second part of the definition that I want to talk about today, which is encouraging that desirable behavior in the use of information technology. And I think this is sometimes the part that gets overlooked when we think about what governance is. And that's really what I want to kind of focus on today. Again, we put the paper out, and this is really sort of diving into those 9 aspects that we outline in the paper. So point number 1 is that there is a lot of inertia when it comes to spending on security controls. And in the paper, we have a bunch of different examples. And actually, I should back up and sort of tell you about the methodology in the paper first. So this is a lot more than just sort of our opinion. We actually dug into a lot of the case studies that Courtney had in terms of loss amounts, but we also talked to quite a few CISOs. We talked to CISOs, we talked to folks in governance, risk, and compliance. We talked to a lot of folks within actual operational security fields that have operational security jobs. And that's really where the paper came out of. So a lot of different types of inputs that went into the culmination of the paper. So the first point is this: it's very tough to move quickly on security control spending. And there's a lot of different examples. These are just a few, but there's this ever-present burden on CISOs to determine not just how much the enterprise should expect to spend on security, but also then convince their governance functions to approve that spend. And we oftentimes think about inaction in terms of financial losses, and those may be considerable, but there can also be losses that extend even beyond that when you think about critical systems that affect people's lives. So it's hard to think about a different approach than this current approach if you're only coming from an audit perspective. There's generally just a too conservative frame of reference, both fiscally and technology, for a lot of board of directors to get on sort of this concept of cybersecurity investment that goes beyond compliance mandates. It's very much still, a leap of faith. And that's one of the problems that we think needs to be remedied in terms of speed to action. So these are some more examples that we put in the paper, and we sort of categorize them left of boom, right of boom. So in the security industry, obviously, we talk about things that sort of happen that lead up to unauthorized access, and then things that sort of happen after unauthorized access, and what adversaries do once they're actually in the system. And we've pointed out, a couple different data points here, but I think the important thing is just helping to think through the loss details and the categories there. So, some of the losses obviously pertain to some sort of, investment in control improvement, control environment, which Sony did obviously after they were attacked by North Korea. Same thing for Maersk, right? They invested a lot of money following the NotPetya attack. Sometimes it's ransom payments, having to make ransom payments where you don't have a different business decision, and that's really what you have to do. Some of the losses obviously are related to regulatory fines. It might even be, paying insurance premiums. But I think that's one of the nice things that Courtney was able to help do, was sort of break down in a very granular way where the losses come from and where they originate, and kind of, what they look like. If you look at it from a customer perspective, in 2019, Capital One had their famous data breach, and the estimate on the loss for them right now is $500 million, or close to $5 per victim customer. 2019, 33,000 customers were impacted by a breach at DSK Bank. They ended up paying almost $18 per victim customer. And then 2016, I forgot to turn off my Bluetooth. The UK Tesco Bank suffered a cyber bank, and 40,000 customers were affected, costing them roughly $26 million, or almost $628 per victim customer. So, the losses, I think, 5, 6, maybe going back further, 10 years ago, it was really difficult to sort of determine in a quantitative way, what comparable losses would be if there was a failure to really invest in security controls. And I think the point is just that we have so many more data points now to help tell that story, especially with the board of directors. So the second point here is that in addition to security spend decision-making being slow, part of that is because it is driven by committee, and it is a very consensus-driven process. And there's a bit of cognitive dissonance here, where senior executives sort of think, well, if a breach hasn't happened to us, we don't really need to spend on more controls. Obviously, SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange recently in the news would suggest otherwise. There's really 4 ways that cyber risk gets escalated to an enterprise relevant committee, as many of you know. So they're self-identified by the business unit, right, via an internal risk assessment. Sometimes it's identified proactively or reactively by the information security team based on some sort of external or internal event. It could get escalated via an audit action point, right, identified in their review, or it could even be highlighted by a regulator's finding, and obviously they're naturally reactive. So, the interesting sort of scenario here is that the National Health Service in 2017 was the victim of WannaCry. And after WannaCry, they subsequently invested $150 million in new controls. And then a couple months later, I think it was 2.5, maybe 3 months later, Maersk got hit by NotPetya. And so the question is, well, why didn't Maersk sort of learn from what happened in the National Health Service with WannaCry? And, is it reasonable that companies can move that quickly, right, to make those necessary security investments before they have sort of that cataclysmic event? So the survey question here is, did Maersk have enough time to invest and make the necessary control changes, having seen what happened to the National Health Service with the WannaCry event?
There we are, folks, the first poll of this particular session, as just mentioned by Levi. So was 3+ months enough notice for Maersk to have accelerated their security program and investments to have avoided the breach? Pretty straightforward answers for all of you to vote on. Let's get as many people participating in this as we possibly can. Love to get the collective thoughts here. Good stuff. We're over 50%. Fantastic. Leave this up for another 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, and 1. Good stuff. Thank you, folks. And there are your results, Levi.
Excellent. So 35% of you said yes. And that's actually, I think, probably higher than we've seen in some of the former polls that we've done on this. And then 30% of you said maybe. So actually 65% said yes or maybe, which is great. Because I think that's the point here, is that you have to be able to improve the governance process when it comes to security spend decision making, and it can't always be about a committee. As you know, committees will meet maybe once a quarter, and it's just not frequently enough to address the speed at which adversaries move. So it's really incumbent upon enterprises to think about, how do we empower people with the authority and the responsibility to make critical decisions about things like security spend, so that we can react when there is something like a WannaCry event. You can react to that, or an Exchange vulnerability event, or whatever the flavor of the month is. Being able to make those decisions without having to wait 3 months for a committee to meet and then make a decision and then actually start implementing security controls. So this is my super ugly Venn diagram. I apologize that I couldn't do better on this, but really what I'm trying to communicate here is that so much of what the board looks at today tends to be around audit compliance. And that's obviously for a good reason. If you don't pass audits, right, very bad things happen to the business, both internal and especially external audit. But we think that ideal digital governance really requires that management and the budget committees have visibility into both audit compliance, but also IT risk management, so that you are properly allocating those cybersecurity resources. There's obviously a lot of things you have to do for audit compliance, whether it's Sarbanes-Oxley, whether it's SOC 2, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're covering additional operational risk from cyber events in the way that many may assume, right? Just because you're passing your audits. And there's obviously good things that come out of the audit function. So for example, in 2018, there were some weak authentication credentials at Erie County Medical Center, but they had heeded their auditor's suggestion to increase cyber insurance coverage actually 5-fold prior to the ransomware attack. So they increased coverage from 2 million to 10 million. And that was an auditor's suggestion. Similarly, at Folksam Group, this was actually last year, there was a data breach, and it was actually the internal auditors that uncovered the unauthorized access. So not saying that there isn't value in the audit function. There obviously is, beyond just getting the check there. But there's a lot more that has to be done if you want to reduce operational risk from cyber events. That's not necessarily covered just in the audit function. We talked about quick decisions in security spend and those sorts of things, but even just thinking about so as an example for audit may say, well, you need to do a quarterly pen test. Well, the quarterly pen test, it's great to satisfy the compliance requirement, but if you really want to reduce operational risk, you should actually be doing control validation in a much more frequent way, which is saying, does a particular threat represent a risk based on the analysis against our current control set, whether it be host-based controls, network-based controls, policy controls, whatever it may be. Are we able to identify gaps beyond just a quarterly pen test review? And are we able to do that with real frequency? So that becomes a big part of this. The compliance framework may say you need to have a firewall, you need to have a security operations center that's 24/7. But if you implement the firewall but you don't properly tune it, or you hire people that are not really qualified to run the SOC, then you can sort of check that box, but it's very difficult to actually reduce risk, right, in the way that you think you should or want to. So on the control validation topic, what does this look like? Well, again, what from our perspective as a threat intelligence company, we're constantly looking at how threat intelligence feeds basically purple teaming exercises, which is sort of iterative red teaming exercises, in sync with a blue team to basically do control validation. And there's products out there that will do automated control validation, or you can obviously do it with teams. But there are so many adversary tools and tactics that emerge daily, that evolve daily. And so if you're not able to do control validation, then there is this certain piece of risk that exists continually, right, beyond just the audit function. So point number 3 is CISO should not report to CIOs. And this may be somewhat controversial. I'm not sure. It has sort of depended, I think, on the group, but we feel pretty strongly about this. And the reason why is because when you have the CISO reporting to the CIO, it sort of creates a misalignment in incentives. The IT department is very much about technology enablement. That is the mission for the business. And the CISO is very concerned with reducing operational risk. Oftentimes, those missions can be misaligned. And we talked to one security operations manager who used to work in a Fortune 500, and he said, basically our job was to remediate security incidents as quickly as possible to avoid that information ever escalating to the CIO. And that's really not the type of environment, or again, right, when we talk about governance, incentivizing behaviors, those are not the type of behaviors that you want to create or incentivize. We really believe the CISO should be a peer of the CIO to align effort effectively and give the CISO, that seat at the senior table and visibility, especially with the board and the CEO. So whether it's, reporting to a chief risk officer, a chief operating officer, chief financial officer, chief legal officer, whatever it may be, that's really an ideal situation for optimal, effective governance. And when you get the reporting structure correct, that can help, with a lot of the other issues that we're talking about here. So for the survey here, it's who do you report to? Or if you're not a CISO, in your organization, who does the CISO report to?
There you go, folks. Once again, options very clear in front of you. CIO, Chief Legal Officer, Chief Revenue Officer, Chief Technology Officer, Chief Operating Officer, or other. Let us know who you or your CISO reports to. We'll leave this up for another 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2.
Yeah, Jason just said it's a good point. Kevin said CEO, right? We should have put that in the poll.
Definitely. And then Jason makes a great point there as well. So let me share your results with you first and foremost. Yep. Other and CIO there. Levi leading the way.
Sorry, I don't see the poll.
Very strange. It should be up. I'll split it out for you. Basically, CIO 48%, other 36%, COO 4%, CTO 8%, CRO 4%. No one for Chief Legal Officer.
Okay. Yeah. So obviously, roughly 50% are still reporting to a CIO, and I think that's probably the default. If you look across industries, that's probably right now the default reporting structure. But I think you're going to see that start to change over time. And again, we think it's a really important point in terms of the way things cascade down from those respective individuals. So point number 4 is that the charts don't necessarily equal good governance, and by that what we mean is that in the same way that the CISO shouldn't report to the CIO, we think that it makes a ton of sense for governance, risk, and compliance groups to basically be in the same organizational structure as operational security teams, because again, right now there's a lot of misalignment that's happening in a traditional enterprise where GRC professionals told us that they really feel like the perception is that GRC is only there for passing audits, and operational security teams are very aloof. They lack the patience to really explain technical concepts and strategies, and there's the problem gets exacerbated because of the way the reporting structures work, where the GRC group typically does report into something like a chief legal officer or similar, right? And then you have operational security teams reporting up into a CIO or CISO. So again, in terms of good governance and aligning motivations and incentives, we think that you can create more mutual respect, right, on both sides if you're able to align them organizationally. And I think today, generally you don't see, at least in my personal experience, you don't see a ton of collaboration beyond sort of the things that have to get done and sort of like pulling teeth. But I think, GRC can add significant value to ultimately, right, to how security resources are allocated and ultimately help those operational security teams, security engineering, the SOC, incident response, vulnerability management, so forth and so on. So we really think that there's just a lot of opportunities to do this better. Now, the one caveat is if you take the operational security group and you move them into a group with GRC, and IT is still over in the existing group or reporting structure, it is certainly important for the IT team to still be supporting the operational security team's mission. And by that I mean, they support all of the tools and the resourcing and the enablement, giving them access to SIMs, giving them access to the tools and the resources they need to do their job. So it's really important just to think through how to optimally structure these things such that everyone is rowing in the same direction and you are able to promote that mutual trust and respect, even though you have very different types of skill sets and backgrounds sort of working on the same problem, which is obviously reducing risk. So the survey question here, do your GRC teams and operational security teams work well together?
And there you go again, everybody. As mentioned by Levi, have you observed GRC teams and operational security teams that work well together? 3 very straightforward answers for you to choose between. Please take the time to vote. Fantastic. Let's push this up over to 60%. 2 more people to vote to get it over to 60%. I'll give you 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. There we go. Can you see the results this time, Levi?
Nope.
No? Okay, no worries. I'll let you know of them. So frequently received 61% of the vote, rarely received 30% of the vote, and never received 9% of the vote.
So that's super interesting. I think in last week in the poll, it was actually the opposite, where we had over 60% that said never, and we had roughly 30% that said frequently or sometimes. So super interesting there, and that's really what you want, right? Is that's the outcome that you're striving for. Point number 5 here. We talked about this earlier, but compliance does not necessarily mean that you're reducing operational risk, right? They're 2 different things. So we talked about it before, but over time, what can happen? And I've talked to a lot of CISOs, and a lot of times I just ask, what is the overarching goal of the security program? And they'll tell me, look, we basically at a high level, we want to increase maturity against the framework, right? We want to increase our capability maturity model. Want to move from a 3 to a 4 or 4 to a 5, right? Whether it's ISO 27001, whether it's NIST cybersecurity framework, whatever it is, like that's really the goal. And the problem with that is that it really creates this check the box mentality. And we talked about it before, if the framework says build a fence, but you build a fence out of bacon, you can check the box, but you haven't actually reduced risk. It doesn't necessarily translate. The other problem that you have with the frameworks is that they don't update frequently enough. They're updating maybe every 18 to 24 months. That is not frequently enough, right, to mirror what is happening in the adversary space. So unfortunately, in the case of technical security controls, good compliance will result in successful audits, but not necessarily reduced risk. So it's really important, we think, for executives and the board of directors to really have 2 real-time views into what's happening here, which is how are we doing? What's our status with audit compliance? But then separately, how are we doing with operational risk management when it comes to cyber? Because they really are, two different things. And it's just really important to reaffirm that with senior executives in the enterprise. Point number 6, I think we've seen over the last 10 years a fair amount of CEO detachment when it comes to cyber risk management. And this very much is a digital governance issue. Gartner expects that by 2024, 75% of CEOs will be personally liable for cybersecurity incidents. And obviously, as they become personally liable and they are removed from the company, that causes negative impacts to the organization. And there really is a need for more personal engagement. I think if the example that comes to mind for me is Equifax, right? Where Equifax 2017, I believe, was sort of the textbook example of what not to do from a CEO perspective and how it was handled. And of course, the CEO was let go a couple months subsequent to testifying before Congress about what happened. But this is just so important. So sort of a counterexample to Equifax would be 2018. Hancock Health had a security breach, and the CEO actually published his own account of the attack and created a blog where he basically kept the public up to date on what had happened and what they were doing, and was very engaged and involved throughout the entire process. So the survey question here is your CEO regularly engaged in cyber risk management, and if so, how often?
Same drill as before, folks. Please cast your votes and your opinions. Is your CEO engaged in cyber risk management? Quarterly, monthly, weekly, daily, rarely, or not at all? Let's allow as many people to vote as possible, please. We have 50% of the vote here. Fantastic. Over 52% now. Fantastic stuff. Leave this up for another 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, and 1. Okay, so the results here, Levi, again, if you're unable to see these, quarterly received 36% of the votes, monthly received 32% of the votes, weekly 18% of the votes, and rarely 14% of the votes. Daily and not at all received nothing whatsoever.
Yeah, so the results set within the weekly and the monthly, I think those organizations are very well positioned, right, on this topic of digital governance. Very, very well positioned if their CEOs are engaging that frequently. It's a great sign for the company and the organization, I think, specifically. So point number 7 is really about quantifying risk. And I put this graphic in the PowerPoint because I think oftentimes when we think about quantifying risk, these are the sorts of charts that sort of conjure in our head. And it's the point is that it's not actually that difficult to quantify risk. There are many frameworks out there like FAIR, and I've actually talked to a lot of CISOs that have tried to implement FAIR and have very little to show for it, sometimes after a multi-year effort. And I actually put out a book last year called The Risk Business, What CISOs Need to Know About Risk-Based Security. It's a quick read. And in it, I talk about threat category risk, which is really sort of FAIR light. And it's really designed to be very easy and practical to implement. It's something you can do in a couple of days, not a couple of years. And I think, Courtney and I really think this is important, again, based on the feedback and the problem sets that we've seen. Unfortunately, you have enterprise executives that are making bad control investment decisions because it's based on bad data. And we're all familiar with likelihood of occurrence times impact. But the problem is if you put garbage into that, you're going to get garbage out of it. And people are making bad decisions based on that. So it's so important that there are, in our opinion, that there is a consistent way to measure risk and to communicate risk. And I think the most important thing is that there are no perfect models anywhere in the world. And that is an important point to state up front, that there is no perfection. And I hear I hear Peloton trainers say this all the time. It's not about perfection, it's about progress. And I don't know how to better encapsulate this point, which is that even baby steps in this area are going to be helpful for CISOs and CIOs to understand, what the risk is and what the corresponding loss is. Because at the moment, most organizations are doing some sort of traffic light signals. They're doing some sort of risk matrix with a high, medium, low, or a red, yellow, green. And the problem is that it's very difficult to convey the risk and the associated loss this way. If you're looking at an amber, you're looking at a medium as a senior decision maker, how do you interpret that, right? Do you lose more sleep? Do you lose less sleep? What does it actually mean? Because at the end of the day, the board really cares about two things. Are we going to lose money from cyber, right? From cyber threats, from risk? Are we going to lose money? And if so, how much, right? Whether you're talking about reputation, whether you're talking about operational outage, whether you're talking about the stock price, whether you're talking about other types of impacts, right? It all boils down to numbers, right? And that's really what the board wants to know. So being able to move beyond risk heat maps and these types of charts into, this is the probability that we sustain X amount of loss this year, right? Annualized loss expectancy. Being able to have those conversations, being able to be very transparent about the assumptions that go into your model and the variables in your model. When people say, well, how'd you come up with these numbers, right? Just being able to have a very straightforward explanation and actually encourage conversation, right, with your internal stakeholders is so important. And obviously GRC has traditional methods that they want to calculate risk for things like business risk and geopolitical risk and all the rest. But cyber is really its own domain. And it's really helpful to have a model to help you think through what those losses could be for the year based on different types of threat categories and the security controls that you have in place. Because as you all know, there are many threats out there, but is a very small subset that represents a risk to your business at any given time based on the control sets that you already have in place. So being able to do those assessments, as we talked about earlier with things like control validation, and being able to inform and populate a risk model, maybe it's quarterly, maybe it's biannually or annually, is really going to help you have those meaningful conversations, especially at the board level. So the attitudes that we really saw when we were writing the paper that you hear a lot is like, well, once a security event materializes, I'll get the budget that I need, that I requested. But basically, we all got to sit around and wait for that security event to happen, which is a super reactionary approach. And obviously, that event could cause great harm to the team and the organization. The second attitude is, well, if I self-identify with a risk assessment, the organization may expect me to solve this issue without additional budget. But if I wait for audit to find it, then I'll get the extra budget. And if audit misses it, how could we have possibly known about it? And that just pushes the problem down the road. So the benefit of quantifying risk instead of qualifying risk is that you can have much more informed conversations. And even if people don't agree with your numbers, you can have those conversations about how you arrived at the numbers and really what the implications of those numbers are. And part of this obviously comes down to cyber insurance policies, right? Where we've done exercises with some of our clients in the past where we sit down and we go through a day of exercise in different threat categories and comparing controls. And a lot of times the answer is, well, we have a cyber insurance policy and the deductible on that's $1 million. So we don't think the loss on this type of event, a ransomware, for example, would exceed the $1 million threshold at the top end of the range here, because that's the deductible on the insurance policy, and we're pretty confident in our policy. And honestly, the attitude, I think there is somewhat of a prevalent attitude, even if it's not articulated this way. I think there is a bit of, well, as long as we're passing our audits and we have a good cyber insurance policy in place, why are we going to invest more in cybersecurity controls, right? And I think that's a very legitimate question, right? Especially from senior executives in the board. And the board always asks, are we spending enough on security? Which is the complete wrong question to ask. But that is, part of this is if you're passing your audits and you have a good cyber insurance policy in place, then why would you spend more on cybersecurity controls? Why would you invest more money? Why would you, if the perception is you're just kind of throwing money away? and there's no real perceived ROI. Why would you do that, right? And this is sort of the way to have a more informed conversation around these types of topics, right? It's almost impossible to have a good conversation if you're not able to quantify risk. So the survey question here is, are you quantifying risk today?
Okay, folks, nice and easy again. Are you quantifying cyber risk? Yes, yes, but poorly. No, in planning stages. No, don't have necessary tools, resources, or just no.
Oh, this is great. I can see the poll results now. Good job, Jason.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
good stuff.
Job.
Good stuff, Zoom. Thank you, Zoom. We'll give this another 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There we go. And can you see the results, Levi?
Yeah, this is great. 55% of you said yes, but poorly. So that's actually the highest percentage I've seen yet by far. So 14% said yes, 3 of you, 12 of you said yes, but poorly. 6 of you said no in the planning stage, and 1 of you said no, don't have the resources. So that's interesting. On the yes, but poorly, I would venture to guess, and I would love to talk to each and every one of you. And by the way, I'm jonesing to start traveling again. So if anyone is available, I'm happy to buy you breakfast or lunch to talk about these topics in more depth. And I'd love to learn more from you actually on how you're doing risk quantification. Everything I've heard from CISOs thus far has really been around FAIR, but again, the implementation's been really difficult for them, and they don't have a lot to show for it, and they're very discouraged by it, which I think somewhat is reflective here in the survey results. So if it's helpful, think about threat category risk. I don't make any money off it. It's really just a side project, and really something that I wrote primarily because I have seen a lot of issues in this space. And I really am all about something that's practical, something that's relatively easy to implement and maintain, and really something that's easy to explain, right? When people get challenged on the numbers, especially the loss numbers and how they arrived at them. So point number 8 is that if you have a collective governance approach, and by this what we mean is that if you're really counting on people inside of your organization to help you with security, and there's really 4 ways that this happens. So there's sort of 4 distinct roles, right? The first one is preventative, which is someone doesn't click on that email link, on that email phishing link, right? I think I saw someone in the chat earlier talk about Maersk, right? The initial unauthorized access on that Petya happened because someone clicked on the wrong link, right? That's a preventative collective ownership approach, right? Somebody in the organization doesn't work in security, right, but understands the responsibility of not clicking on that supplied phishing link. The second is detective. So someone notices suspicious activity, like files being opened by someone that doesn't have a need to actually be looking at them, opening, viewing them, and then they escalate that observation. So that'd be a detective type role. A corrective role would be, of course, resetting passwords after some sort of near miss or cyber event. And then 4th is directive, right, which is rewarding individuals when they practice good security hygiene. So preventative, detective, corrective, and directive. And obviously the issue here is that when every employee is part of being on the front lines of security, they're also an asset to threat actors. And especially with everyone working at home, whether it's their own computers, their own phones, or just the behaviors like we talked about, clicking on the wrong links and that sort of thing, there is this huge threat surface, and every employee technically represents a potential point of failure, and sort of victimization sort of feels inevitable. And in the paper, we talk about Blackbaud, which was a cloud services provider that had sort of adopted this collective ownership approach, and had a really significant breach in 2020 that affected over 20 million people. If you're not going with a collective approach, right, the alternative here is basically very carefully crafted overt and covert surveillance of your employees' activities, but that really diminishes trust across the company, and it's very counterproductive to collectively trying to motivate your employees over time to help detect and subvert cyber attacks. So we think that the collective approach is a smart approach, but employees really need to be informed and empowered to act beyond just your traditional compliance training, where everyone's watching that 3-hour video and taking, the test and again checking the compliance box and moving on. It's really a fantastic opportunity to create very compelling training for your employees that is going to help them improve security in their personal lives. And if you do that, whether it's things about how to use wireless, how to use social media, things that you should be doing when it comes to protecting your children, protecting your financial details, when it comes to your PII in general on fraud and identity theft. Right? These sorts of things, if they're valuable to employees in their personal lives, I think there's a lot of translation and carryover into the professional world that will also benefit the organization. So that is point number 8, and I'm running out of time. So point number 9, and this is the last point here, is that you really do need that near real-time unified view, again, of both what's happening within governance, risk, and compliance, but also operational security. And we talked about this earlier, the need for both silos, the need for both areas to be covered. But in order to achieve that sort of visibility, it really is going to require automation. I think I saw someone in the chat window talking about this earlier. You really do, right, have to bring technology to bear on this. You're not going to be able to hire a group of interns and give them a spreadsheet, right, and say, okay, we need to go create this near real-time view of how we're doing in both areas, right? You're going to have to make some investments here to make this happen. You can't just sort of create a point in time risk register and hope that's going to do it. We talked to one GRC veteran where she said, they brought in an external party, one of the big 4, to basically identify, what are our critical business processes and what are our critical security controls. And this company came back and said, okay, well, you've got 900 controls that you need to implement. And that's just sort of mind-boggling, right? Those sorts of numbers and sort of tracking that many controls. They eventually got the list down to 256 controls just to satisfy the audit regulatory requirements. But we all know the complexity here is just mind-boggling sometimes. You have to bring technology to bear here, excuse me, so that senior executives and decision makers do have point and they are able to look at basically a real-time view of what's happening in both areas, and that is going to far exceed the point in time presentations that may happen quarterly. So can't really drive this point home enough, and you all work in IT, so I think this to be true. One example that we heard from a security director, he shared his experience with a recent denial of service attack. His company very heavily reliant on their e-commerce platform for the majority of their revenue. And when they got hit by a denial of service attack, it took the site down. And a lot of questions sort of followed, with questions like, how much does this type of attack cost the company? How much does a new control cost to mitigate these types of denial of service attacks in the future? What is the probability this type of attack occurs again this year? How often this year? Do we need a business process change? If you don't have automation in play, these questions can take too long to answer. And we've already talked about the inertia that happens in terms of making decisions about security control spend. If you don't have technology up front to present these types of real-time views, it really can create more risk. So the real-time risk views is going to help ensure stronger governance. So I so much appreciate your time and attention in the presentation. Thank you so much. If there's any questions, you can always email me at levi@recordedfuture.com. I'm on Twitter. I'm on the Twitters. I'm on LinkedIn. And again, would love to opportunistically buy any and all of you a meal and talk more about this topic, which I'm very passionate about. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jason.
Thank you very much. And I'll just leave Levi's details up on there, as you can see, levi@recordedfuture.com, for anyone who's willing to looking to reach out. And again, if anyone would like to chat to Recorded Future team, please let us know at Sync and we can connect you. Doesn't leave too much time for Q&A. Very, very thorough, as also mentioned by Tim Edwards in there, very well presented. The one question I am going to ask is, of all those points, which is the one you emphasize most?
So I cannot, and I probably spent an inordinate amount of time on this, but I really cannot overemphasize the importance of quantifying risk, because and I see, some comments here. You feel like you're having a circular conversation that never ends when it comes to security resourcing. And when the board comes to you and they say, are we spending enough on security? You want to flip the question right around and say, you tell me where your risk thresholds are, and we can have a conversation about whether we're spending appropriately. If you're not comfortable with a 30% probability of losing $5 million this year based on these threat categories and the roll up into this number, if you're not comfortable with that probability, then no, we're not spending enough. But if you are comfortable with that, then yeah, we are. And I think that's the point, is when that question comes from the board, you really want to take the opportunity to flip it around, right? And talk about their risk tolerances and what those mean in loss terms, right? Talk about the caveats with the cyber insurance policy, right? And how that factors into the numbers, right? In the risk equation. So I really cannot emphasize that enough. I mean, there's a lot of things that will help with governance in terms of improving the governance situation. And we talked about, a lot of different points, but that's the one that if I could prioritize anything, that's the one that I would really spend a lot of time and resources on.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, that does bring us to a close to the session, folks. So thank you all. Again, I just want to comment on the amazing collaboration going on in the chat there. Really kind of this topic seemed to have ignited a lot of discussion in that chat box there, Levi. So that was great to see.
Excellent.
Very quickly, what was the name of your book? Someone did ask what the name of the book was again.
Yeah, I'll see if I can get it up here. It's you can get it on Amazon.
Whoop. No, you're disappearing.
There you go.
There you go. Yeah.
So you can get it on Amazon, or you can actually grab it. I believe there's a soft copy PDF that you can grab off the Recorded Future website. So I think it's like $11 on Amazon if you want a hard copy, and it only take you maybe 2 hours to read it at most. It's a quick read, like I said, or you can grab the PDF off our website.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for your participation again. Virtual round of applause, please, for Mr. Levi Gundert of Recorded Future. That was absolutely fantastic. Very insightful, very thorough indeed. So thank you very much.